And welcome back. The 2020 presidential elections are historic for many reasons. One in particular, Kamala Harris being the first African-American woman, as well as the first person of Asian descent elected to be vice president of the United States. This comes during a period of intense racial injustice. People are being attentive to the country's political justice system, political system, the police system, the legacy of racism, as well as the disproportionate use of violence in communities of color. It's a moment where many people of color particularly are also having crucial conversations about history, race, and anti-Blackness within their communities. And while many people are discussing being Black, Afro-Latinx people are not included in the conversation. Our next guest was the first ever to be an Afro-Latino woman to run for vice president of the United States in the 2008 Green Party ticket, and also a leading scholar on the issues of the Afro-Latinx identity. We're pleased to be joined by Rosa Clemente, who is also an activist, a political commentator, as well as an independent journalist. And Rosa, good to have you.
Oh, it's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
We'll start off with the initial question. As we are headed now for a change and a transfer of power, we mentioned in the intro Kamala Harris being that first African-American woman and woman of Asian descent to actually be elected to the vice presidency of the United States. Tell us a little bit about just your thoughts on this whole transfer of power. We're going to receive a new president-elect.
Yeah, if there's not a coup by the current president, I don't think people are really understanding the serious nature of what is happening. It's not really about him conceding. He actually does not have to do that. That's not a legality. It's him and really rallying up his base to prepare for his eventual removal from the White House, whether on his terms or not. And how his base, particularly white supremacists and white militia, what they are preparing for that inauguration week, days, or now, or, right after Biden and Harris are in there, so I think people need to really, really pay attention on that. I think it is history has been made. It's the first Black woman of color, Asian descent woman, Indian woman who is the vice president, so as a historian, I always understand the nature of historical first and what that really means, especially for a lot of young women, young men, young non-gender binary folks that, are seeing someone that could reflect them. I mean, obviously that also happened in 2008 with President Obama, and I would just hope that people understand that, what got them in there was obviously the vote by African-American women. And that is very important for them to keep being told that, but it's going to be like very critically important that movement on the ground already start holding them accountable, because some of their potential cabinet picks are already very problematic. Even before they announced them. And as someone who's in a third party, and like I said, we can see at some of the cabinet picks already that they're digging in that well of corporate Democrats, warmongering Democrats, and Democrats that have a hard line on immigration.
Well, what gives you pause?
Jeb Johnson, he was the head of Department of Homeland Security. Obama and Biden created a deportation machine that Trump rode in a veracity of speed. I am not sure where he lies around undocumented young people, particularly. I'm sure they will pass DACA, which already has set up a tier of what is a good immigrant and a bad immigrant. We're not hearing about Congolese immigrants, Cameroonian immigrants. We're getting reports of how they've been tortured in ICE detention centers, and probably more, because every time we talk about immigration, we focus on Latino people. But there are African and undocumented people that are in ICE, as well as Vietnamese ones that are reporting horrendous abuses, and how do you stop that? You don't stop it by reforming it. You stop that by what we should be demanding from this administration is amnesty for all undocumented people in this country, no matter your status, how long, where you're at, what you do. I'm very troubled about former Representative Cedric Richmond, who has a slew of really a bad trail of a lot of the nefarious things he was doing to make money off him being a representative. I don't see any progressive right now. I know that most of the cabinet picks right now are defense and Homeland Security, and I think that shows already that that's their main concern. And also bringing in old school corporate raiders, like from the 2008 recession in this country. How are you going to put the same people that were the cause of it, or especially somebody like Larry Summers? And I would also caution people, like, just because it's a black and brown face in there does not mean that's a progressive or left politic, and that there's a lot of dependence right now on this small group of representatives, the squad. I would include Katie Porter. I think she's amazing. But look, there are 5 congresswomen who have been marginalized and are being talked about in very bad ways from their own Democratic Party. So all of that gives me pause.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and let me interject and just talk about, I mean, at the time that we're going and we're doing this taping right now, it has not yet happened, but we understand that President-elect Biden is also looking to possibly nominate Alejandro Mayorkas to become the first Latino Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Your thoughts on what that would potentially mean?
That means he's going to put a brown face in there to keep deporting more, particularly Latino, Latina, Latinx immigrants. That's what that means, So the Democrats are going to do what the Democrats do, the party itself. And I think there's a lot of overdependence on what they're going to do policy or agenda-wise. I mean, if they were that serious about saying, we know we're here because of Black women, young women, and movements, they would already be adopting the Breathe Act from the Movement for Black Lives. They would already have at the White House or their roundtables on activists and organizers who want to play a part in that, in what the cabinet picks even look like. Those are very important picks. And they're gonna go through a very fast process. And Leslie, I'm super concerned because the next brother, the next sister, the next trans or queer person that is murdered by the police, like, police murders are not going to stop. And people have to understand that all through their campaign, they were very clear. They are not about defunding the police. Biden made it very clear in every rebellion that he sided with, quote, peaceful protesters and not looters. And we've been through this before. It's like the same old kind of script. And my caution is also movement leaders and visible people who people do follow and listen to are like gonna get bamboozled and played, because unfortunately there's never a consequence for the Democratic Party because we're in such a horrific condition with Trump and his criminal syndicate around him that no person who has love for humanity would have pulled that Trump lever, although 75 million people did. And I think that's where movements better begin to focus on, like, these white supremacists, these militias are planning something. They are too quiet right now. They are planning something. They're planning something with weapons, with takeovers. I mean, history shows, well, like, if we look at Reconstruction, the post-Reconstruction era, that's when the KKK came up, the Jim Crow, lynching, and all of that, because at that moment, Black people were coming out of slavery and beginning to engage in not only politics, but self-determination in their communities. So there was that backlash, except now that the white lash is visible and they don't care, and they go on TV and they bail out, like they just did this week in Kyle Rittenhouse, someone who went to the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, killed 2 BLM protesters, and now is out on $3 million bail, mostly from Trump supporters, where he had a party last night and was posting from his party. He killed 2 protesters. He's out on bail, and he has now become a symbol of, I don't call it the far right, but the white supremacists and militias and what they're preparing to do.
Let me revisit something that you said just a few minutes ago, because you said there is a need for concern, given the fact that you feel as though the Trump base is kind of like quiet ever since his defeat. Nothing has really been said. Do you feel, and you're feeling like there's going to be a militia movement possibly, potentially, after this is all over with, when we see a Biden presidency take effect?
I think there's going to be actual militias acting out in the streets. I think they are going to go around and kill Black and brown people. And his base, like, it's not his entire base, obviously, but when his base goes from 33% 3 weeks ago thinking the election is fair to now 77%, you're talking about 75 million people that voted for Donald Trump. They are not going to let that go. And it could go from anywhere to, your social media tweet, but also to unleashing those who would use physical violence, who are looking to target particularly Black and brown people. I'm in Albany, New York, 2.5 hours outside of New York City. The Proud Boys, one of their biggest chapters is around the corner meeting where I live. Okay, this is Albany, New York. And we've had them here for over 3 years, but what does a Proud Boy look like in Mississippi or Iowa, where there's major Latino communities that always have been under attack, that work in the meat packing industry? So yeah, I think they're planning a whole bunch of levels of disruption. And I'm also caution people, like, I in no way believe that we should be working with the Republican Party at any level. And it already, for me, is like, why are the Democratic Party, the winners, saying we're looking forward to working with our colleagues? Your colleagues that still won't concede an election, that are trying to steal the election, there's no like common ground right there. And I know people are saying, well, how do we bring the country together? Elections don't bring the country together. They never have. Only way to bring the country together is to apologize for slavery and beginning the reparations process for African Americans and dealing with that original sin. So usually it's the Democrats who are like, already, let's sit with them. I am happy to hear AOC and her squad and a couple other people saying, listen, you got here and we're keeping you to these promises. And also these Republicans, we're going to remember them when we're in power. And when that power happens, as the Democratic Party, they should, movement should ride it as hard as they can to have some relief for the majority of our people in this country.
Most people know that you are a member of the Green Party, and that's not Democrat or Republican. We talked about Democrats and Republicans, but you ran on the presidential ticket on the Green Party, vice presidential candidate in 2008. Talk to us a little bit about that Green Party, because most of America usually falls Democrat, Republican, Independent, but then the Green Party continues to grow and continues to rise. Acquaint people with the Green Party who may not be so familiar.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Green Party could have risen more and potentially been what we would call a major party, which means that in a presidential election, we would get 5% of the electorate. But I think two things have happened. Post me and Cynthia running, the Green Party really did not clear out like this old vestige of white liberalism and white racism within the party, particularly from older white men. So instead of having, like, let's say me or Cynthia become the spokesperson for the party, where we could have helped grow it locally, the Green Party started losing a lot of what me and Cynthia brought in, not the politics, but the changing nature of an electorate. So then here we have 12 years later, where the Green Party is actually at a very weak point and being removed permanently from states because they're not able to bring home the votes they need in a presidential electorate. And also I look at 2016, and, there are still people like they did in 2000, where they blame Ralph Nader for Al Gore losing. In 2016, much of the blame fell particularly on Jill Stein of why Hillary Clinton lost, as opposed to say, well, maybe Hillary Clinton lost in Michigan and Wisconsin because she never went there. So I know that this year was a very hard run for the Green Party ticket because so many people were nervous about, quote, a third party upending a Democratic win. And if that it could have happened in that way, I think we need to really examine the fact that there are so many young people that literally felt they had no choice but to vote for Biden. And that's not how it should be. There should be more than a Green Party and a Libertarian Party and a Democratic Party and a Republican Party. Third parties should be flourishing. But right now, with the corporate kind of duopoly and the amount of money that it takes to not just run a presidential election, we could look at the upcoming mayor's race in New York City, where that'll probably be a $1 or $2 billion election for whoever the mayor becomes the candidate and wins. So there are local wins in the Green Party, and the Green Party is growing, definitely like in California, Ohio, Minnesota, but it's not growing in the way it should be growing in the Northeast. And I think part of that problem is that the Working Families Party exists, but often the Working Families Party ends up aligning with the Democratic nominee of whatever race.
Mm-hmm. For yourself, talk to me about Latinx voters. You know, we talk about African Americans making that difference, particularly in Michigan in this particular presidential election, Pennsylvania, Georgia. And what gets lost sometimes is when we talk about brown faces, the Latinx culture. Talk to us about the influence of the Latinx culture coming into the area of politics, particularly as we move forward. We understand with the census, in particular, that when we deal with the census, that Latino population is going to be the majority in just a short amount of time.
Yeah, so, you know, even calling it the Latinx vote, right? Only 2% of quote Latino people even use that term. I think it's another term that was ascribed to us by not us for our community. But I do understand that there's an umbrella way that we look at demographics anyway of those who are part of the electorate. So if we were to just, for the sake of this conversation, say Latinx, 60, 65 million of us, I mean, there's a diversity in that as well. And the one thing that is missing in that conversation is those of us who identify racially as Black and say we're Afro, Black, Latino, Puerto Riqueño, Dominican, and all of that. But I did find it, you know, interesting that in all the op-eds that are coming out, mostly by like white people telling us like completely erasing the Latino vote, is that, you know, Pennsylvania, Biden wins that, but I want to see what the amount of Puerto Ricans that voted for Biden, because there's over 300,000, right? If we look then in Georgia, the amount of Latinos, it would not compare to, again, the African-American woman vote, but it was the highest vote that turned out. And part of that as well is that a quarter of the quote Latinx people in this country are 18 to 24. So many of them voted for the first time. If we look at Arizona, the reason that state flipped was because of 10 years of movements on the ground, like Mi Gente and so many immigrant rights groups. Then if we look at Florida, well, I'm like, they could have won Florida. Biden and Harris could have taken Florida. What they did wrong was they went and courted the kind of expat vote of Cubans, Venezuelans, Colombians, older, privileged, white Latinos that got scared of any talk of socialism, right? But why didn't they go to the 1.5 million Puerto Ricans that live in the state of Florida, who have been dispossessed from Puerto Rico? They didn't go there at all, but Donald Trump did twice to the Puerto Rican community. All lies, of course, saying he would give us $18 billion and all of that. I mean, like, all lies. But I'm like, why wouldn't you go speak to not only the Puerto Ricans that are automatically, once you come to Florida as a Puerto Rican, you can vote as an American citizen, but also Puerto Ricans in general have one of the highest turnout rates anytime they vote. 84% of Puerto Ricans did vote for Biden and Harris. If they had hit that 90 to 92%, they would have flipped Florida too. And I even think in the Latinx conversation, we don't hear about Puerto Ricans. We don't hear about Dominicans or Central Americans. And no, we're not the majority. Mexicano people are, but we make up part of the majority. So it's going to be interesting how they're going to try to capture this quote Latinx vote, but at the same time, probably alienate those of us who refer to ourselves as African or indigenous descent, and kind of keep this weird Latinx thing that really doesn't mean anything racial, ethnic, gender. And where are the demographics coming out of that community? They don't exist.
Right.
So I'd be curious to look at those numbers, but I do believe that Puerto Ricans, along with Mexicanos and other Latinos, made those states that did flip along with our African American sisters, why they turned blue and didn't stay red, especially Arizona and Georgia.
Yeah. Allow us to revisit Florida for a minute, because I think many people are still scratching their heads when they hear the amount of people who were Latino who voted for, who voted for President Trump. How do you break down that demographic? And again, help us to understand, what is the argument that was made to win these people over to say, hey, I'm gonna punch the vote for Trump, when we understand what happened in Puerto Rico, when we understand what he said about immigration, when we understand all of the vile things that has been, bought out by mouth and also by action, but yet and still you see those push the lever for him. Give me a little bit of more background into why people made that decision.
Yeah, well, again, the Puerto Ricans in Florida, 82% voted for Biden and Harris. Okay, so we're talking about 18% that didn't vote or maybe voted for Trump. I think there was an oversampling and over estimation that didn't take into account that even the Latinos who voted for Trump were mostly men and not women, right? But one thing that is important to note in Florida is that there are people still who fled Cuba during the revolution, and they still harbor resentment, animosity, and hate for anybody that would talk about communism or socialism. And then you have a growing group of expats that have been forced out of Venezuela and Colombia. So the way I would look at those is these are also usually lighter skinned Latinos who have some sort of privilege, who are very scared of anything re-socialism. And the Republican Party spent over $20 million in ads in Florida to scare particular Latino voters to not vote for, quote, Biden or Harris because they were socialists, right? So that fear mongering happened. But if you look at the younger demographic, like 90% of young Latinos that voted did vote for Biden and Harris. So I think that goes to your very first part. It's an oversimplification of a very complex and diverse electorate. And it's also a geographical thing, right? Like what a Puerto Rican looks like in Florida and Pennsylvania may be different than what a Central American thinks and it looks like in terms of politics in Iowa or Utah, and I also don't think that there's been enough conversation on how many Latinos actually couldn't vote because they're struck with COVID and have either died or are in hospitals. I mean, Latinos are now at a rate that we're dying 4 times more, and African Americans 3 times more because of the COVID crisis. But when it comes to Florida, there's always going to be that community of a smaller and smaller electorate that for some reason always, it is seen as the power broker when the numbers are just not showing that.
Yeah. So talk to me about 2021 as we continue. The election is over. Of course, President-elect Biden will take office. We've got a lot of things taking place. But for you, the issue of advocacy and policy and strategy doesn't end. It continues. Where do you go from here in terms of your policy, your advocacy, and ultimately your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm an organizer, I'm a journalist and trying to finish a dissertation. I don't, like personally, I would never run again. It gives me the ability though, then to support not only candidates in the Green Party, I'm really supporting Diana Ramirez, who's running for the first Afro-Latina woman to run for New York City mayor. Like I'm excited about her. Diana Ramos. I'm excited about her campaign. I was just on a virtual fundraiser with it. She is totally employing every agenda policy of the movement for Black Lives and other organizations of color. I think what 2021 is going to look like is making sure that even the things that Harris and Biden said they weren't going to do, like not cancel student loan debt and not implement a Green New Deal, it's almost like they don't have a choice. And what I was they don't have a choice if movements stay on them. I was really happy to see the day after election, the Sunrise Movement, right already in the offices of Biden and Harris, like you must adopt a Green New Deal or you will not be reelected. So for those that engage in electoral politics, I want to still support them. I want movements to support them. I also want us to also always understand that voting is not essentially, the ballot doesn't free us, is what we do the day after our vote. And that our movement should now not just be about getting people into office. We got to rebalance that. Too much of our movement space, understandably why this election is just now focused on electoral politics, when there's still so many people disengaged and disenfranchised from the electoral political system. Community groups and grassroots organizations are the bridge to that, right? And that's when we get what we want. We don't get what we want when we vote somebody in. We get what we want when we make them not only keep their promises, but do not let up. In fact, engage even more at this moment.
Do you foresee a lot happening, given the fact that we still have to wait until till the end? We're talking about this upcoming senatorial seats and the votes to find out who's actually going to win the Senate back. Given the fact that there's a possibility Democrats may not win the Senate. If they don't, how hard will it be for Biden and Harris to move a needle, particularly in areas for communities of color, given what we know the Republican Party has stood for up in Washington?
Very, very difficult, you know? So Biden better get out his executive order pen and do what Trump did. I don't want people, I'm not trying to hear like, that's what Trump did, Biden can't. No, that's exactly what he should do, especially if Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, I mean, like if they're already re-elected, and best believe everybody I know is almost in Georgia. I'm like, I hope it turns out really well. Either way, if it flips Democratic, everything we want and more. If it stays Republican, I want to see executive orders down the line. Mass incarceration, Green New Deal, rent moratorium, cancel the rent, cancel student loan debt. I do acknowledge this, even in my critiques and all that. I acknowledge that Biden and Harris will at least bring humanity and science back. So particularly people getting COVID, we will not be in the situation that we're in at this moment, you know? But what do we got, 60 days left? This dude could do anything in the next 60 days. So it requires us to be ready, not travel, but be ready to get in the streets if we have to. But yeah, if they don't get the Senate, they're going to do what they did with President Obama. And they made it clear. They're going to stop everything. They're not going to let anything through, which then requires us to even double our efforts in the streets to make sure that at least around the COVID crisis and evictions and insecurity around food, those have to be fixed immediately, and they can be fixed immediately. Like, don't give the Pentagon $1 trillion. You could give that to the people. You know, this is what's happening right now is one of the most inhumane things I've seen in my lifetime, but I actually never thought it would be where people in this country are going to die because there's not enough nurses, doctors, or hospitals. That has to be addressed on January 20th, day one.
Rosa Clemente, we leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Social Justice Forums.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All righty, we got to take a quick break, but guess what? We do have more show. Stay with us. We'll return with more on the Social Justice Forums right after this.